Almost exactly a month after Prime Minister Modi was in the United States, where are the Indo-US relations? To discuss the broader Indo-US relations and of course the US role in Indo-Pacific, we are fortunate to have with us two specialists who are visiting India, two American specialists on Indo-US relations and of course the broader US, India, China relations and the way forward. I'm happy to welcome Jeff Smith of Heritage Foundation and Tanvi Madan of Brookings to Strategic News International. Let me start with you, Jeff. A month after Modi was in the United States and the trade talks are still stuck at some place, we don't know where. How do you see the relationship at the moment?
Sure. First of all, it's good to be back with an old friend.
Thank you.
Yes. And, you know, I've been an optimist on India-U.S. relations for a long time, and I remain optimistic today. I think you rightfully brought up the trade relationship. I wrote a paper earlier this year on Modi 2.0, and one of my principal conclusions was the first objective is do no harm. And that is trade tensions have bubbled to the surface over the past 2 years in a way that they haven't in contemporary times. They've been a priority for the Trump administration in a way that they haven't been for previous administrations. And we saw moves like GSP benefits revoked, steel and aluminum tariffs imposed, and the potential, I thought, for USTR to open up a Section 301 investigation if there wasn't progress on the econ front. So those of us who are invested in the strategic partnership have for a long time tried to prevent economic grievances from deteriorating or degrading that strategic partnership, and I think most part we've been successful. But for the last 2 years, there's been a real risk of that. And so I thought my big objective for the year was to prevent that from happening and get the two sides, hopefully see the two sides come to some sort of agreement on trade and investment that would alleviate some of that pressure. And we're not there yet. It hasn't been signed, but all indications are that there's been a lot of progress made on at least an interim deal, a modest arrangement. We saw signals yesterday, just this week, I think, from the Indian side and also from the US side that they're very close. And potentially, if they do reach an interim agreement, may even begin looking at a bigger trade agreement, which you know, may prove too ambitious, but it shows you the direction we hope it's heading. So I'm relatively optimistic about the state
which you always have been. So,
yeah,
so,
right.
So Tanvi, let's take it a little broader. I mean, trade apart, the defense relationship has been central to India-US relationship for almost 15-20 years now. But even that doesn't seem to be going anywhere, the defense part of it. How do you see that?
I think if you look at it more broadly, I still think the defense and security relationship, if you just look since the Trump administration has come to office, has actually deepened even more than in the last few years before that. And whether it's the signing of the foundational agreements, whether it's in these trilateral, bilateral and multilateral exercises, the quadrilateral kind of ministerial, I'd put that within the larger framework, that you are seeing progress on some things. In fact, some things that people said would not happen. And I'd include things like even the revival of the Quad. You know, doing more in terms of US, India, Japan, Philippines doing a group sale. These through the South China Sea. These things would be considered, have been considered unthinkable a few years ago. And I think what that does is that even though, and I would say the kind of two areas where I think people would like to see progress on the defense side is one is on defense sales.
Exactly.
And because I think particularly because they would have understood, you know, the money might not be there right now, etc. But I think what particularly grates in Washington is that a number of deals have been signed with the Russians, including, of course, S-400. I think people would like to see a little bit more movement also on the, you know, the trade and technology partnership, obviously on both sides. And that hasn't really, you hear has some positive movement, but we haven't seen more there. Having said that, I still do think this has been where, in fact, I would say the optimism comes from, is that in Washington there's a sense that in the last few years, particularly thanks to India's neighbor up to the north, and I can use the word since I'm not a diplomat, China,
Yes.
that India has been willing to do things, that weren't possible before, or it wasn't willing to do, and that's actually provided some space to the broader relationship. And of course, the kind of meeting of the minds in some senses around Doklam, and kind of the response that India got, not public obviously, but private, but also I think support. I think there's a recognition over this last year or so that India sees that the US can be a friend at the UN Security Council and not traditionally, like in the Cold War, a problem.
That's true. In fact, that brings me to the other thing that is happening in DC as you are here in India, is the subcommittee, the Foreign Relations Committee, which had the hearing and on the human rights situation in Kashmir. How do you see that having panned out?
Well, I regret not being there for that. And I haven't had the opportunity to watch the full hearing yet. I did see parts of the first, so it was split into two parts, one with government witnesses and a second with non-government witnesses. I thought Acting Assistant Secretary Alice Wells did a very good job explaining the administration's position on the Kashmir dispute, which really boils down to 3 points. First, it's an internal matter for India. Second, any issues that arise with Pakistan should be handled bilaterally. And third, the U.S. hopes to see an end to the restrictions soon and a return to normalcy. And I thought she articulated that position well. The second part of the hearing was, I think, a little more contentious. And there were several congressmen looking to sort of score points. And, they have raised a level of criticism about the Kashmir decision. Now, I'm of the opinion that in a democracy, congressmen are free to voice their opinion on whatever they like. So if they hope to see an end to restrictions soon, so do I.
Of course.
If they want to criticize the Indian government, they're free to do so as congressmen. What I would not like to see is a change in U.S. policy on the matter as a result of that criticism, unless the conditions on the ground change. And if the restrictions were to worsen, if they were to continue for, into the indefinite future, you would see a change in U.S. government policy. But if, as I expect, they continue to ease, especially as the winter comes, I think you'll see U.S. government policy remain consistent on the matter.
Yeah, there are no indications that there's going to be any change anytime soon. And in fact, the Indian government, I think, can live with what happened at the hearing there. So moving on, bringing the elephant in the room, China, and we've just had less than 2 weeks ago the second informal summit between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi. How do you read in DC, to you, Tanvi first, and then to Jeff, the outcome of the second informal summit, and how does it impact Indo-U.S. relations, if at all?
I think it was interesting comparing the response to the Wuhan summit and the kind of the Chennai Mamallapuram summit this time in the US. During the Wuhan summit, there were a lot of questions and some concern that this was India suddenly changing its mind about China, that it was this reset of substance, and Jeff and I were amongst the folks, I think, saying that, look, it's a resetting of tone, getting back to a stabilizing situation after a situation of stability after Doklam, but none of these fundamental differences had been solved, and they're unlikely to go away. And so this is kind of about managing the relationship and seeing where it can be moved forward. I think this time you saw recognition of that. So you did not see too much kind of reaction in terms of we're losing India, so to speak. And so I think there was an understanding that this was to some extent about optics, to some extent about continuing to engage Xi Jinping given where he stands in the Chinese system. And that there was, I think what was noticed was that there was some movement on an attempt to move forward on economic engagement with the setting up the high-level trade and investment mechanism. I do think where this will play in on the US-India side is, I think that what would have been noticed in Washington is that even as this, there was a build-up to this visit, It didn't go back kind of to the olden days where India would say we won't do certain things because it will upset. Now, yes, there was some who noticed that the Huawei had been allowed into the Indian Mobile Congress. But I think there was also people who noticed that, the Quad was upgraded to a ministerial, the very successful visit. Of course, both those things also would have given Prime Minister Modi space and leverage with the Chinese in Chennai. So I think that it does play in, but I think the broader structural issue remains the same. That China's not just, I think its rise per se, but its behavior are causing concerns in India and the US that mean that there are shared interests in managing its behavior at the very least, or shaping its behavior, I should say.
Exactly. In fact, I personally believe, and Jeff knows this, that the Chinese worldview is hierarchical. And in that hierarchy, they're always at the top. I mean, they want other states, nation states to bow down to them, or at least, pay obeisance to them, something of that kind. But in this summit, I thought Xi was under pressure himself because of the domestic situation, the economy not doing too well, he being now the main target internally of the party, dissenters. I mean, that's what the voices that we hear. Do you see that?
Yes, I think President Xi is under some pressure internally from economic conditions, but also externally from the United States. And we have seen China and President Xi recalibrate its foreign policy actions when it comes under pressure from the United States. And it wants to see a friendlier relationship on its southwestern border, on its eastern borders. We've seen a calming of tensions with Japan, with India, with ASEAN, when it feels under pressure from the United States. And so I think there were two phenomena there happening, as Tanvi rightly pointed out. I think one was a recognition that we need to get back to a more stable place after Doklam. And two, that we need to shore up our relationships around the periphery while we're under duress from the U.S. and while economic conditions at home are putting us under stress. So they have every incentive to play nice with India right now. And I think the Indian government isn't under any illusions about what that means, but is willing to bank whatever benefits it can and keep this relationship on a relatively stable course.
I think that's what I think the overall philosophy is, that keep engaged with China, and what Deng Xiaoping did in the late 70s, early 80s. Keep your head down and bide your time. I think India needs to do that, and India is doing that from what I see. But to China, I mean, the pressures that she is facing is not just economic or the US pressure, but Hong Kong.
And Xinjiang.
And Xinjiang.
Yep.
And Tibet.
Yep.
And there is the Dalai Lama factor, which sort of raises its heads once in a while. So how do you see that playing over the next 6 months, let's say?
I think it depends on how it plays out in the situation, in kind of the broader, and what other countries and how they react to the situation. I think, you see this in terms of the broader situation in another time when the US and China weren't at this kind of friction point. Yes, some members of Congress might have made comments on Hong Kong or on Xinjiang. I suspect an administration that wanted Chinese support for one thing or the other would have not done so directly. They have done so now. India, of course, has not. But I do think it stays in the background, right? That if China does say a few too many things on Kashmir, at maybe not Xinjiang, but on Hong Kong, because there are Indian citizens there, Indian businesses there, that India could at some point express concern at the very least. So I think the fact that not only is this situation in Hong Kong playing out, it is playing out in a crucial year, an anniversary year for the Chinese.
70th.
In the 70th year. Yeah. And so I think in some ways this does create space. It does two things. One, it gives Xi Jinping, who's under pressure at home and abroad, in some ways, he's still quite powerful. So I think we shouldn't underestimate or overestimate where he stands. But that it does create space for India to take advantage of the situation, because he needs to not just, sort out his domestic situation, but keep his periphery stable. And so it gives China an incentive to come to the table in a way that it did at Wuhan as well, which was when the US-China trade wars was perhaps like really starting to intensify. So I think it creates space for India in a way that India can take advantage of. And not just doing what Deng Xiaoping said in terms of hide and bide, but also something else he did, which is he took a potential adversary and used them to strengthen his domestic economy.
Talking about the U.S.
The U.S., yes.
But, and that's the interesting point, that she did not bring up Kashmir or Article 370 and its amendment in the informal summit. And despite the fact that Imran Khan was there just 2 days before that. Does that indicate that they have now reconciled to the changes in Jammu and Kashmir as an internal matter?
Well, I don't know if they'll come out and say it's an internal matter, but I think they've reconciled that their ability to do anything about it is quite limited. And I actually was surprised President Xi didn't feel compelled to at least give a cosmetic appearance that he was raising the issue. You can be sure that was a main ask of Islamabad. I think the Chinese know that they don't have much ground to stand on to argue that this somehow impacted the China-India border. They tried that initially.
And I think Jaishankar just killed it from the beginning.
Quite obvious that that wasn't the case. They tried their best to get a UN Security Council open discussion on the matter, a statement issued, unsuccessful. I think when they saw that Islamabad couldn't even rally its allies in the Muslim world, that they were in fact conveying awards upon Prime Minister Modi, that the Saudis announced their largest ever investment here immediately after the decision. I think the Chinese are reading the tea leaves and seeing that there isn't much international support for taking a stronger stance on this. And frankly, I think they're getting a little bit tired of being out there all alone defending Islamabad, whether it's on this issue or whether it's on the terrorism question. And you saw them walk back from their defense of
Masood Azhar.
Exactly. And so I think, they're not going to abandon the relationship. It's deepening in many ways.
Yes.
So I don't want to sort of overplay that, but it is a phenomenon worth watching.
I think so. And just final thoughts. I mean, I thought the informal summit had one takeaway for me, that the two leaders, despite all the differences, all the contentious issues, boundary, trade, and of course Pakistan's nexus with China, are willing to keep engaged, keep the relationship on an even keel, and that then is going down to the officials. I think there is a lot of work to do for the officials in the coming year before the next summit takes place, India-China.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things, the boundary talks which were postponed, the very clear message that they wanted the special representatives to move on that. I think then they will have to be work on the trade and investment side, which, there'd been that theory even in India and in China from about a decade ago that if economic ties could help solve these problems. But economics ties have become a source of friction. So I think this idea that you really need to show some significant movement. There's been we've seen some opening in China in terms of Indian goods, but it's been minuscule. But I think the message was sent by India that we want more market access. We want more, I think the word balanced was used multiple times. Recognizing that China, you want to invest in our market, and without suggesting it in a very direct way, saying, look, that they could be you're not going to get one without the other. It has to be mutually beneficial. So I do think there's a lot of work. And I think the other area I noticed that there was some desire to, whether it's confidence building measures, making sure that military, on the military side, that there was some engagement that did
much more. In fact, I don't know whether you've studied the statements or the outcome of the informal summit. There was only one difference I noticed, that while India said the boundary question should be settled with just and reasonably, the Chinese said, or is the other way around, just and equitable, just and reasonable, where the two words were different. So, that's something that very few people have noticed, but that is something to watch out for, I think. As a China watcher, what do you think?
I can't interpret that level of diplo speak. Don't put me in the middle of that. The difference between equitable and reasonable, I'll have to think on that one.
That's right. So on that note, thank you both of you. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm sure our viewers will benefit from your insights on all the triangular relationship between India, China and the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nitin.